The silence that screams, smash the like button if you're brave enough, subscribe if you dare, and drop a comment before the silence closes in. Because once you enter this story, there's no turning back. The first thing Deputy Marshal Evan Cole noticed was the quiet. Not the peaceful kind. Not the calm before the storm kind. This was a heavy, crushing quiet that pressed against the eardrums like deep water. It followed him as he stepped out of the armored transport and onto the concrete intake corridor of ADX Florence, a place the Bureau rarely spoke about and never romanticized. Supermax. Administrative maximum. The prison of silence. Cole had transported fugitives, gang leaders, and men who smiled while describing what they'd done. None of that prepared him for the soundlessness here. No shouting inmates. No clanging bars. No distant arguments echoing down corridors. Just the hum of ventilation and the soft, deliberate footsteps of guards trained to move without announcing themselves. The man in the back of the transport, inmate ID redacted for internal documents, had been silent for the entire drive from the airstrip. Not a word. Not a cough. His wrists were cuffed, his ankles chained, his head bowed like someone already in prayer. He was being transferred from a high-security penitentiary after an incident no one wanted on the record. 3 guards injured. 1 dead. The official explanation used words like altercation and noncompliance. The classified report used a different vocabulary. As the intake door sealed shut behind them with a hydraulic sigh, Cole felt it. The sensation that this place didn't just hold people. It erased them. 2 hours later, the alarm sounded. It wasn't loud. That was the unsettling part. A series of muted red lights pulsed along Corridor D, a silent signal that something had gone wrong in a place designed so that nothing ever did. Control room operators froze, eyes snapping to monitors. Every movement inside ADX Florence was tracked, timed, and predicted. Deviations were rare. Emergencies rarer still. On a black and white feed labeled D-17, an inmate lay motionless on the concrete floor of his cell. The cell door had not opened. The camera had not glitched, and the inmate had not been scheduled for movement for another 6 hours. By the time the response team reached D Block, the man was already dead. They would later say it was suicide. They would cite isolation, mental strain, pre-existing conditions. The report would be stamped, filed, and buried beneath layers of classification. But the guards who stood over the body that night knew something was wrong. There were no ligatures, no wounds, no signs of struggle. Just a man, alone in a concrete box designed to contain the worst humanity had to offer, dead in absolute silence. 3 days later, the FBI called in Dr. Mara Ellison. Ellison was not law enforcement. She was a behavioral analyst with a reputation for walking into places others avoided and asking questions that made powerful people uncomfortable. She had studied hostage psychology, cult leaders, and the long-term effects of solitary confinement. Her reports were meticulous, her conclusions unsettling. When she arrived at ADX Florence, she carried only a notebook and a warning from her supervisor. They want tea like what you find. The warden met her at the Sally Port. Thomas Granger was a man carved from routine, his face lined by years of enforcing rules that never bent. He spoke softly, carefully, as if raising his voice might crack the walls. "We don't have incidents here," Granger said as they walked. "That's the point of this place." Ellison glanced down the endless corridor, identical doors stretching into infinity. "Then why am I here?" Granger didn't answer. They passed cell after cell, each one a concrete tomb with a steel door, a narrow slit of reinforced glass, and a feeding slot. Inside, men lived alone for 23 hours a day, some for years, some for decades. No group recreation, no shouted conversations, no contact except through thick glass and muffled intercoms. The silence wasn't accidental. It was policy. Ellison stopped at D-17. The cell had already been scrubbed clean, but she could still feel it. The residue of something unseen, something unfinished. She knelt, studying the floor, the bed bolted to the wall, the stainless steel sink and toilet molded into a single unit. Everything accounted for. Everything sterile. Who was he, she asked. Granger hesitated. "His name doesn't matter." "It always matters," Ellison replied. The file told a fragmented story. The inmate had been a strategist, not a soldier. A man who never pulled the trigger himself, but made sure others did. Organized violence across borders. Witness intimidation. At least 12 confirmed deaths tied to his orders. He had survived 3 assassination attempts before being sent here. He didn't break, Granger said quietly. Not like the others. Ellison looked up. The others? Granger realized too late that he'd said too much. Over the next week, Ellison interviewed staff, guards, psychologists, control room operators. Every conversation followed the same pattern. Initial professionalism, careful wording. Then there are inmates who stop talking after a while. One guard admitted, his eyes fixed on the floor. Not to us, to themselves. A prison psychologist described men who lost track of time, who paced their cells until their feet bled, who begged for silence and then screamed when it arrived. It's not punishment, the psychologist insisted. It's containment. Ellison wasn't convinced. Then there was the new transfer, the one Cole had brought in. Inmate ID still redacted. No interviews permitted. Level 6 restrictions, reserved for those deemed incapable of safe human interaction. Even among ADX Florence's population, this man was considered an outlier. Ellison requested access. The request was denied. She requested it again, citing the recent death. Denied. On her third attempt, she received a visit instead. It happened late, after most administrative staff had left. Ellison was reviewing surveillance logs when the lights in her temporary office flickered. The door opened without a knock. Warden Granger stepped inside, followed by a man in a dark suit Ellison didn't recognize. "This is Deputy Director Hale," Granger said. "He oversees special containment." Hale's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Dr. Ellison, I've read your work. And yet you keep me away from the most relevant subject," she replied. Hale leaned against the desk. "Some inmates aren't here because of what they've done. They're here because of what they can do." Ellison felt a chill. "To whom?" Hale straightened. "To others. To systems. To people like you." The meeting ended without answers. But that night, Ellison couldn't sleep. The silence pressed in, even in her quarters. She replayed the footage from D17 again and again. The moment the inmate collapsed. The absence of any visible cause. On the fourth replay, she noticed something new. At exactly 2 hours, 17 minutes, and 43 seconds, the audio feed spiked. Not a sound. A frequency. Barely perceptible. A low vibration that lasted less than 2 seconds before flatlining. It wasn't human speech. It wasn't mechanical failure. It was something else. Ellison cross-referenced the timestamp with facility logs. At 2 hours, 17 minutes, and 43 seconds, a systems test had been initiated in D block. One not listed on the official schedule. She printed the data and slipped it into her notebook. The next morning, an inmate in C block began screaming. He didn't stop. For 6 hours, he screamed until his voice shredded into hoarse gasps, until guards feared he would die from the effort alone. When they finally sedated him, his last words echoed down the corridor, carried through the silence like a curse. "They're not keeping us quiet," he rasped. "They're listening." That afternoon, Ellison received a single-page memo slid under her door. "Investigation terminated. Prepare for departure." She stared at the paper, heart pounding, as realization settled in. The death in D17 wasn't an anomaly. It was a warning. And somewhere deep inside ADX Florence, beneath layers of concrete and silence, something was happening that no report would ever record. But when Ellison turned the page of her notebook to review her final notes, one line stood out, written in her own handwriting, though she didn't remember writing it at all. "If silence is enforced, it's because someone is afraid of what might be heard." And when she looked up, she realized she was no longer alone. The architecture of control, the man standing in the corner of Dr. Mara Ellison's temporary office, did not introduce himself. He didn't need to. She recognized him instantly from the intake footage. Deputy Marshal Evan Cole. "You shouldn't still be here," he said quietly. Ellison closed her notebook without breaking eye contact. "Neither should you." Cole exhaled through his nose, a sound halfway between frustration and fear. "They told me the investigation was over." "They told me the same thing," Ellison replied. "Yet you're here." For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them felt engineered, like the corridors outside. Finally, Cole stepped closer and lowered his voice. "I saw something the night I brought him in," he said. "I tried to report it. The report disappeared." Ellison's pulse quickened. "What did you see?" Cole hesitated, as if the words themselves might trigger alarms. The intake scanners flagged abnormal neurological readings. Elevated stress is normal. What he had wasn't. His brain activity spiked whenever the facility system cycled, like he was reacting. Or responding, Ellison said. Cole nodded grimly. Exactly. They moved to the control room under the pretense of a systems audit. Inside, a wall of monitors displayed every inch of ADX Florence, cells, corridors, rec yards encased in concrete. The facility looked less like a prison and more like a machine, each inmate a static component locked into place. Ellison noticed patterns immediately. Why do system tests rotate through the same blocks? She asked. The technician on duty stiffened. Security optimization. That's not an answer, Ellison said. Cole leaned in. She's right. Randomization prevents predictability. This is patterned. The technician swallowed. Above my clearance. Ellison exchanged a glance with Cole. Clearance. The word hung heavy. Later that day, Ellison finally gained limited access to archived psychological evaluations, heavily redacted but still revealing. Patterns emerged. Inmates who entered ADX Florence with high cognitive function, leadership traits, and strategic intelligence deteriorated faster than others. Not into rage, into silence. They're not breaking down, Ellison muttered as she scanned the data. They're shutting off. She requested interviews with inmates flagged as non-responsive. After hours of resistance, she was allowed one. Cell C09. The man inside sat perfectly still on his bed, hands folded, eyes open. He did not react when Ellison spoke. Not to his name. Not to questions. Not even when the intercom crackled to life. What happens during system tests? She asked. For a long moment, nothing. Then his lips moved. They map us, he whispered. Ellison leaned closer to the glass. Map what? How we think. How long it takes before the noise inside stops. His eyes flicked toward the ceiling. They don't want silence. They want obedience without resistance. The intercom cut out. The interview ended. That night, Ellison and Cole reviewed maintenance schematics smuggled out by a sympathetic engineer. Hidden beneath standard infrastructure diagrams was an auxiliary system routed through every cell. Not audio, not video, frequency modulation, low-level sound waves below conscious hearing, designed to disrupt circadian rhythm, emotional regulation, and long-term cognitive processing. The science was controversial, the ethics non-existent. This isn't containment, Cole said, voice shaking. It's experimentation. Ellison nodded. And the ones who die aren't failures. They're data points. Before they could copy the files, the screen went black. Security lights flashed. An alarm, this time audible, echoed through the facility. Unauthorized access detected. A voice announced calmly. Cole grabbed Ellison's arm. We need to go? Now. They barely made it into the corridor before guards flooded the control room. Doors slammed shut behind them, sealing sections of the prison with hydraulic precision. ADX Florence was locking itself down. As they ran, Ellison realized something chilling. The lockdown wasn't for them. It was for the inmates. In D block, a door opened for the first time in years. And inside, the redacted inmates stepped into the corridor, alone, unrestrained, smiling. The silence had finally been broken. When silence fights back, the first thing Dr. Mara Ellison noticed was how wrong it felt to hear footsteps in D block. ADX Florence was designed so sound died before it traveled. Every corridor absorbed noise. Every surface swallowed echoes. Yet the footsteps were unmistakable, slow, deliberate, unhurried. Someone was walking without fear. Deputy Marshal Evan Cole pressed his back against the concrete wall, weapon drawn but useless. His training told him this was impossible. His instincts told him to run. The redacted inmate stood beneath a flickering light at the center of the corridor, hands clasped behind his back like a man inspecting his own kingdom. His eyes were clear. Too clear. Not the hollow stare Ellison had seen in dozens of inmates reduced to silence. This man looked awake. You shouldn't be here, Cole said. The inmate smiled faintly. Neither should you. Ellison felt the words hit her harder than any threat. He knew them. He had anticipated this moment. Guards rushed in from both ends of the corridor, weapons raised, shouting commands that echoed uselessly. The inmate didn't flinch. He raised one finger. The lights went out. Emergency systems kicked in instantly, bathing the corridor in blue-white glow. But something else happened. Every intercom crackled to life at once. Not noise. Breathing. Hundreds of inmates, synchronized, exhaling slowly. Ellison's chest tightened. He can't control that. The inmate turned toward her. I don't, he said calmly. The system does. Cole realized the truth too late. ADX Florence wasn't just suppressing inmates. It was synchronizing them, conditioning minds into predictable patterns. Silence wasn't the goal. Uniformity was. You mapped us, the inmate continued. Every thought, every fear. You stripped away chaos until only structure remained. And then you forgot one thing. He stepped closer, stopping just short of the guard's firing line. Structure can be rewritten. The emergency doors slammed shut across the facility. Cell doors opened. Not all, but enough. Inmates stepped into corridors they hadn't seen in years, moving without panic, without sound. They didn't speak. They didn't run. They walked with purpose, following a pattern only they understood. Ellison grabbed Cole's arm. "This isn't a riot." "No," Cole whispered. "It's a system override." The inmate turned toward the nearest security camera, tilting his head slightly. "You wanted silence," he said. "Now listen." Every monitor in the control room lit up with data spikes. Brainwave synchronization across multiple units. The very frequencies designed to break inmates were being mirrored back into the system, creating feedback loops. The prison was listening to itself. Alarms blared, this time uncontrolled, overlapping, chaotic. The silence that defined ADX Florence shattered into confusion. Ellison understood then why the inmate had been redacted, why his history was erased. He wasn't dangerous because of violence. He was dangerous because he adapted. He figured it out, she said. He learned how to think inside the silence. Cole lowered his weapon. "What happens now?" The inmate met Ellison's gaze one last time. "Now the experiment ends." With a final keystroke from somewhere deep in the facility, the auxiliary system shut down. Frequencies died. The artificial calm vanished. The inmates stopped moving. Some collapsed. Some cried out for the first time in years. Some simply sat where they stood, overwhelmed by the sudden return of unfiltered thought. Security forces stormed the corridors. The redacted inmate was restrained without resistance. As they dragged him away, he leaned toward Ellison. "You should tell them," he whispered. "Silence doesn't erase the mind. It sharpens it." By morning, the official report called it a systems malfunction. No mention of frequencies. No mention of synchronized inmates. No mention of the redacted man. Ellison resigned within a week. Cole was reassigned. ADX Florence returned to silence. But months later, a sealed envelope arrived at Ellison's home. Inside was a single sheet of paper, an internal memo stamped confidential. Auxiliary system reactivation approved. At the bottom, a handwritten note. Iteration 2 begins. Ellison stared at the page, heart pounding, realizing the truth no one would ever admit. They thought the silence had won. But somewhere inside ADX Florence, minds were already listening again. And if you think this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes after the silence.